an author and co-founder of the White Ribbon Campaign, which you might know is the largest effort in the world of men working to end violence against women. He's a senior research fellow with the Research Institute Pro Mundo, which is based in Washington, D.C. He's a former deputy director of the Center for Research in Latin America and the Caribbean at York University, where he taught social sciences for many years. But today he's here to share his latest book, The Time Has Come, Why Men Must Join the Gender Equality Revolution.
Thanks very much.
It draws on his work as an advisor, writer, activist, researcher, and popular educator, and focuses on engaging men to promote the rights of women and girls, to end men's violence against women and create better lives for men and boys. Over the past 4 decades, he's worked in 50 countries with the United Nations, governments, NGOs, women's organizations, unions, businesses, and universities. And I'll remind you again that his book is on sale at the back of the room, so if you like what he says, don't forget to pick up a copy. Thanks, Michael.
Wait. A copy? I mean, it's
Several copies, of course.
I mean, there's like holidays coming up in 8 months. I mean, there's.
Good point.
Yeah,
Good
shop
point.
with it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I don't even know if I need this. Is this even on? Is it on? Is it okay? We're hearing sound. Being invited to speak by one of not just the countries, but the world's preeminent research and education institutes, centers, is on one level daunting. You know, as I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking, God, I better do some fresh research and just have a PowerPoint that is so packed with data and figures that your heads will be swimming and you'll think, God, he really, really knows what he's talking about. I decided not to. Partly because there are people in this room who will out data and out research me any day of the week, so I would never do well on that. But I thought it might be more interesting to do the presentation that tweaks here and there, but a similar presentation that I've been doing in different communities as I've been speaking about this book. My usual presentations don't include a PowerPoint, but that will be part of this one because we have a bit more time. So for some of you who are in the business, you can take this also as a bit of a meta presentation. So thinking about how we can do popular education on themes of gender inequality, on themes around feminism, women's rights, transforming the lives of boys and men, and of course ending men's violence against women. So I'll be at times referring back to why I'm talking about a certain thing a certain way. I think our starting point, what brings us together, is not just a set of problems that have been with us in many ways for millennia, such as men's violence against women, but an incredible moment that we are living in. I mean, over the past year and a few months, is that all it is now? Is this the explosion of the Me Too movement? I had to stop there because it just seemed long enough, didn't it? You had the same reaction. It's like, yeah, for the year and a few months, last October of 17, I guess it was, we've seen conversations that were just in the margins of society, in our centers, in some NGOs, women's organizations, and academia. We've seen conversations that were familiar to some of us move right into the social mainstream. So conversations that were held around conference tables are now being held around kitchen tables, boardroom tables, in staff lunchrooms, in locker rooms. And that makes this a really exciting moment. It makes it an amazing moment. It's a moment where those of us who've been working in the field of promoting women's rights, ending men's violence against women, where suddenly the work that we've done it's often felt slogging. There's now a huge platform to popularize the ideas, the research that many people have been doing, to reach new people, reach many people. But even beyond just reaching people, to say that ideas that we have held, that the women's movement in particular has fought for over the past 50 years now, those ideas we insist should be ideas in the mainstream. These aren't just ideas for debates or nice discussions or for fine-tuning the fine points. But if we really believe in the world equity, if we really believe in the role of human transformation, then we have to say we believe that those should be everyone's values, and not just values led by a small group of people. So this is a moment where we can take things that were marginal, that were out there even, and say this is a process of how do we, not just that they're in the mainstream, but how do we continue to shift the mainstream. So that's the spirit of my talk. Now, the overall framework is, as you heard, it's in relation to my book, which has, as you'll see, has a number of different themes in it. But as soon as I say, if I'm in a group saying I'm here to talk about gender equality, the assumption is that we're talking about women. That would be the assumption, that we must be talking about women, the lives of women. But I think one of the things that we need to do is within any discussion of gender issues is we need to make men, this doesn't work apparently. What do I hit? Enter? We need to make men visible within a discussion of gender issues. The whole invisibility of men within a gender discussion is one of our problems. It's one of our problems because just like a discussion about so-called race or sexual orientation, the standpoint of those with power is seen as just the default position, just what's normal, what doesn't have to be talked about. So most of us who have my skin color wouldn't feel, oh, I've got to talk about my race experience. What does that even mean? I'm not racialized, I'm normalized. What does that mean as a race experience? If we're straight, we don't normally talk about our sexual orientation. It's just like, well, yeah, no, I'm just straight. And again, we've made invisible our sexual orientation. And similarly with gender, our ideas, ideals, self-definitions, power relations as women and men and those who don't find themselves as either way. In order to sort of to look at these issues, we have to look at the totality of it. So the role of both this book and my work over the years is to make men visible within a discussion around gender. Now, one of the things particularly I'm not worried about in this particular audience, but certainly when I'm in communities, when Barb and I are working together with some work we're doing with a mining company, and so you're working in a mainstream setting, and you're there, here I am to talk about gender issues. And of course, I think for many men, in spite of the fact that these issues are moving into the mainstream, there's an instant reaction. And the instant reaction is, you're here to crap on me. A friend of mine, a few of you may have heard of Gary Barker, says that one of the things he doesn't like about the term toxic masculinity is when most men hear that term toxic masculinity, it's like they're watching a foreign language film. So someone says toxic masculinity, and the subtitle says, men, you're shitty. Or he says something like that, I can't remember. I think it depends who he's speaking to. But basically, no, you're bad. And so one of the things that is critical is that as we engage men, as we work to reach out to men, we stress that this is not about collective blame. It's not about saying that men are a bunch of monsters. There's a sort of collective categorization of men, that we're not a bunch of dolts and idiots. But it is about finding ways to talk about the practices, the attitudes, the beliefs that have become mainstream or hegemonic in the lives of boys and men. But to say that even though this is not castigating men as a group, it's also saying that men shouldn't be scared of powerful women. So this is the framework for my talk, thinking about these things. So let's get right into it. So the work that I do, my book, this little talk, is inspired by the power, the strength, the courage, their heroism of women in the women's movement. And I don't say that just by way of saying a nice thing at the beginning, but particularly, I think that, again, for those of us who do popular education, we're often working in environments, the world, where the majority of people weren't around in the 1960s. They weren't around in the 1970s. They actually weren't around in the 1980s, probably, if you start adding it up. And so what that means is that the living memory of pre-second wave feminism it's starting to fade away. It's in some of our minds, but for many people there. And I think one of the things that we need to do as activists, as researchers, is continue to go back and both be able to state where we were at collectively, where the world was at, where patriarchy was at 50 years ago, and the impact that women's movements have had. And to also understand that very basic things like a woman standing up in Parliament, for example, was met by catcalls and ridicule. Right here in Canada, I can't remember the last time, but not that many years ago. So this isn't long ago that women stood up against incredible odds. But we'll be talking about why gender is an issue for men. It's not about women winning and men losing, but the paradoxical and strange ways that in the process of achieving gender equality and equity, women obviously will win, but men will benefit too. What I'll be calling the paradox of men's power. But also talking about what we can all do. What we can all do, whether it's as researchers, as members of communities, families, religious institutions, workplaces, educational institutions, whatever it might be, what we can do to take action. What we can do to take action. Working to end, and not just some abstract gender inequality, but addressing that and understanding the many props and intersectional props that create our gender status quo. So that's what I'll be trying to look at, how we can work as well to end the gender binary and transform the lives of men as well as women. There's a lot of emphasis out there in the world when we look at the issues around gender equality, often focused on women at the very top. You know, if you pick up business sections and you scan them for the past year, most articles on women would be about women on boards, women in so-called C-suite, meaning CEO, CF, these top leadership positions. And so there's this focus on women at the very top levels of leadership. Now, obviously that's important. If we believe in equality, we believe in equality throughout a society. But of course that does not touch the lives of the vast majority of women. So it's really important that as we discuss these issues, and what I try to do in this book, is to talk about the type of social, economic, political, and cultural transformations that will bring gender justice to the world, to our homes, to our workplaces, to our communities, to our religious institutions, our nations, and so forth. And finally, if I have time, I've got 3 hours, I think it was. Well, 1 hour, somewhere in there. If I have time, I will be doing a bit of a bait and switch. This book, as you can see, I use the term gender equality in the title. I'm using gender equality as an umbrella term. I'm using it very loosely to capture a whole number of different issues. But the last chapter of my book is a bit of a bait and switch, because the last chapter is why gender equality is not enough. So if we have time, I'll get to that. And if we don't have time, I'll still get to it, and no one will be in the room, but I'll keep talking. So anyway, whoever, one person is left. Okay, let's just jump right in. So the one thing that I would normally do at some length of us speaking to a group that I'm guessing is different from this group is start by addressing one question, and I won't spend long on it because you don't need to, you know the answer to this question. But the question is this: we often hear, and it's certainly out there, the notion that we now live in some sort of post-feminist society. There's a big, is this okay doing this sort of meta, jumping back and forth between actually doing presentation and talking about what I do in a presentation? Is that? You nod because you do education. That's right, you go, yeah, that's anyway. So what instantly comes up in our communities often is this idea, well, yes, feminism was necessary, there was a problem of gender inequality, but that was back then. Now, the pendulum has shifted the other way. So we have whole organizations, the so-called men's rights organizations. We have popular authors like Jordan Peterson. We have those many young men who are attracted to those I don't know if we call it movement, but those excrescences, whatever, excretions, right? Anyway, those things, I shouldn't be so pejorative, but anyway, those things. Who would say, yes, maybe in the past, but now the pendulum has shifted the other way. Now it's men who are the ones who are discriminated against, women have it all. So, we still live, and this is where I would spend much longer, but since the slides are here, I just have to show you, and they're funny pictures at times too, so you don't want to miss those. But we still live in a world in which men are making $1.30, $1.50, $40, $50 for every dollar that women make. We still live in a world in which most of our political leaders and our religious leaders are men. Some we like, some we don't like, some maybe we like in some ways and not so sure about in other ways. We still live in a world in which our economy and our economy, our companies are run by men. And let's face it, what a great job my half of the species has done on the economic front in recent years. We still live in a world in which our biggest sports heroes, the ones that we pay the most, celebrate the most, described as the real athletes are men. And women's sports are still seen as the women's auxiliary. If you're into basketball, you watch the NBA, the real thing, or you might watch the women's NBA, golf, PGA, and the ladies' PGA. Women's sports are still the secondary events. They don't get the attention. We still live in a world in which women's bodies are used to sell products. And they're not just arbitrary images, but images that sometimes connote power, control, and so forth. We still live in a world in which women do a disproportionate amount of the housework and childcare. That's true in many of our homes. That is, has equalized. It's certainly improved, it's improved a lot over the past 20 years in Canada and in some other countries. Men are doing more of the housework. Men are doing more of the childcare. In some homes, in some heterosexual homes, men are doing more of those things. But overall, across Canada and certainly around the world, women are still doing a disproportionate amount of those things. We still live in a world of persistent sexual harassment at the workplace, although not usually of such a blatant form, although, well, of course, we still have that. We still live in a world in which, well, we do live in a world, there has been improvement. There are times when we do hear women's voices for a few seconds. So we still have this persistent silencing of women's voices and the belittling of women's experiences. We still live in a world where we have job ghettos, where we have areas of work or professions where we have disproportionate numbers of women working, and where we do, there's less prestige and less pay. One of the ones that is so representative of the problem is our educational institutions. So if we go up the educational ladder, we start off with daycare workers. They're not even usually called teachers, but we have daycare workers teaching the very young. And then we have elementary school and high school, then university professors. In terms of prestige, there's no contest, university professors at the top. In terms of pay, there's no contest, university professors at the top. And of course, historically, we've seen, and it's, again, one of these things that's changing, but we've seen at the level of daycare overwhelming, this is still true, overwhelmingly women, elementary, still a lot of women, and then by the time we get to high school and then university, of course, traditionally overwhelmingly men. And one of the interesting things about this is how this is, and this is not to belittle my colleagues for 1 second in terms of, I mean that seriously, but when you think about when we learn most in our whole lives, it's not in a talk like this, even when you have an incredible speaker coming in. It's not in our classes, it's in our first 5 years of life, isn't it? Most of what we learn in our whole lives is when we're newborns, when we're infants, when we're toddlers. And yet, those who care for, look after, teach in the broad sense are the ones who are least paid, least respected. Why? Because, of course, it's seen as just an extension of women's work. It's what women are naturally good at, caring for those kids. So we have all these job ghettos, and the outcome of those job ghettos is that men are seen as doing the important work while women cheer us on from the sidelines. And so as we go up the corporate hierarchy, or what McKinsey calls the corporate pipeline, consulting has done this work, as we go up what they call the pipeline, from entry-level professional positions, where at the entry level, about a total of 48% are women. By the time you get to the top level, it's down at 22%, which again is an improvement over the past 5 years, but it's still a small minority. And you can see that the diminution, the reduction, is even greater for women of color. And we also see similar disrepresentation. This is from the U.S. Of men of color. So this is still our reality. So as we go up the corporate or public sector hierarchy, we see more men at the top. So in spite of progress, and I think we should celebrate the progress, and I mean that, and I mean that not just rhetorically, But you know, it's so easy, those of us who are activists, who are change makers, who are researchers for change, it's so easy to focus on the problems that lie ahead. You know, we're so, because we get, that's, you know, we're good at that. We're so concerned about the problems in the world, we focus on the problems. And what that denies, what that ignores, is the incredible progress made over the past 50 years. The problem with ignoring the progress is this. The progress that has been made has been because of the women's movement, women's activism, and the role of those supporting them, such as researchers, teachers, educators, who have made sure that the ideas and ideals of feminism have a greater impact. Now, if we don't celebrate the accomplishments, then we're left saying, well, what's been the point of having a women's movement? What's been the point of having you know, a center? Why bother? But by celebrating the impact, by celebrating the accomplishments over the past 50 years, we're able to say, see, activism works. See, informed research works. See, education works. So it's a bit of a balancing act. I do think we should celebrate the accomplishments at the same time as talking about where we still need to go. So you would think that within this context, men, my half of the species, would have it made in the shade. And indeed, we raise boys to fit into those realities of men's power. A story that a few of you have heard me tell before, and it's in my book, and I keep trying to retire this story, but it just keeps coming back. So for the two of you who haven't heard me speak before or read this book, sorry, I just apologizing to my gang. But anyway, it was the moment when it really became clear to me how young kids are when we begin to just bombard them with these ideals of gender. And that was when my son was born. So I don't know, who here's been in a delivery room with a baby being born? If I asked that question, you know, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, there would not have been a couple men raising their hands. Because the men, of course, were sitting out in another room, you know, just waiting, you know, not knowing what's happening in there. It's like, so is the window open yet? Has the storm flown in? I mean, anyway, we do have some men, this is great. So anyway, so there we were in the delivery room. My kid had been born for 5 seconds, and I didn't yet know if it was a boy or girl. Now, it's not because I'm dumb, know the difference, but I had so many tears in my eyes. I couldn't see the little thing. I mean, the little thing on the little thing. I didn't know if it was a boy or girl until the nurse spoke, and up to this point, the nurse had been, you know my son as an adult, I know it's sort of weird hearing. So, you know, until the nurse spoke, I didn't know, and suddenly, you know, she went from talking like this to suddenly talking like this, and she said, "It's a boy, what a strong little fellow." And I was totally shocked, not because it was a boy. I'd taken high school biology, I figured 50-50 chance, more or less, of that one. But I was shocked by the change in her voice and what she said. And you know, if it had been a girl, her voice would have gone up higher, and she would have said how beautiful, sweet, and cute she was. And that's when it begins. Some say even before. And these experiences from birth, how we hold babies, how we talk to them, the clothes that we buy. Some people say, well, so what? What's, you know, who cares what color clothes or what toys or whatever. But this, as I was saying before, is our most profound moment of learning. You ever notice how much a baby sleeps? The reason why babies sleep so much is because they're investing a staggering amount of energy into building their brain. When we are born, our bodies are basically fully formed. They're just in miniature, with one exception. The exception is our brains. Our brains are only about 10% developed in terms of the adult structures and connections. Every single day, a newborn baby is creating millions of new neural connections, neural linkages. And how does that happen? Well, it happens within a natural and a social context. You know, we've all had that old discussion, argument about, you know, are these things nature or are they nurture? And actually what we now know is it's an antiquated polarization. Because what human nature is this. It's based on the plasticity of our brain, as an ongoing changeability of our brain, but in which most of the profound changes happen in those first 5 years. And they keep happening quite rapidly through our teenage years, and then they start slowing down. But this changeability of our brain, that's our nature. But what it means is that we're able to absorb right into our developing brains social realities. So it's that nature and nurture combined. And not only is it this plasticity of the brain, but it's happening within a social context. And the social context, of course, for most of us, is a nuclear family. A a family structure that has transmitted over the course of millennia, in different forms, and not all a nuclear family, but a sort of patriarchal family structure over the course of the past 8 or 10,000 years, has transmitted the values, the expectations, the relationships of power that exist in a gendered society. And so what that means is growing up within that, as a little baby, as we take in the world of the physical, the social world, and of course we don't understand, well, what is socially constructed? It's not like my little son was there going, wow, I'm being dumped with gendered expectations at this point. What is happening instead, of course, is he's being just soaked in it. I use a rather cheesy analogy in the book, or metaphor. I'm supposed to be right, but I can't remember which it is. But anyway, I don't know if any of you did this, but in grade 1 or 2, we did this great science experiment. And we got a thing of colored water, and we put a stick of celery in it. Did anyone do this? A few of you. This is how crappy are you? This is because of the conservative government screwing up our education system. Not all of you did this. Anyway, after a few days or a day, whatever it is, the celery has soaked up, into its being the colored water. Well, in a very crude analogy, the brain is in a social environment, and we are soaking up. It's really crude, but we're soaking into our developing brain the gendered expectations. In other words, our brains become gendered. Gender is not just floating in our head. And this is one reason why personal change is so difficult. I might say, I'm a pro-feminist man. I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. But on another level, it's a certain set of ideals about myself and the world are part of who I have become. That's one reason why change is so challenging, because it's become embodied in our brain. And it gets embodied in our brain, and we're surrounded with, as a boy, images of you will be powerful, you will be strong, you will operate machinery and equipment, you will learn how to fight, you will be fearless. This is one of my favorite ones, this idea of being fearless, not even having too many feelings. I don't know. This is one of the most incredible. I do want this to be like an open space where I can talk openly, and I do want to tell you I did have a feeling once, and it's rough. But anyway, it's out there now. So we're not supposed to have feelings. This idea of being fearless, we have to learn to fight, and it's not just learn to fight, learn to take the pain, take the punishment. I think we focus a lot on the offense part of fighting, but for boys, to be a real man means you got to take the punches, you got to take the blows. You don't complain, you just keep moving forward. You play through pain, you keep fighting. All these images. We have these ideals that a real man stands alone. We don't need help, even when we're bad with lung cancer, that sort of thing. So the real man is just lives in isolation. You could say at a certain level. In some ways, things have gotten better. I mean, I like it that men can hug each other now in our culture. That's good. We don't have to whack each other in the back when we do, but we've made progress. But at the same time, we're also supersizing masculinity. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I was a kid, these were my superheroes. If I show this, as I do, in a high school or junior high, the boys go hysterical at this point, and they say those flabby middle-aged guys are superheroes. And I look down at my little belly and I go, I'm looking pretty superheroic myself. But in all seriousness, and my fellow, are we septuagenarians, sexto, whatever we are, old geezers in the making, can remember this, but these were our images of invincible masculinity. We can only fantasize about being that powerful, that super heroic. But if we couldn't live up to that, think of a boy now trying to live up to this. And not just the impossible body, but the difference from these sort of goofy, benign looks to this I'm going to kill you, you motherfucker sort of look. Here's another one. Here's the original G.I. Joe action figure. Here's G.I. Joe now. In case you can't quite see that in the back, here's a pectoral close-up. Here's just one final one. A Luke Skywalker action figure, and here's Luke now. So we've taken these already impossible images of manhood, and we've blown them out of all proportion. And we do this not just for kids, but for adults with images, advertising images. There used to be a time when women started first raising issues around the use of women's bodies and objectification of women in advertising. Men would say, oh, it's just a picture, don't worry about it. But now, of course, some guy's driving around the city and he sees these Calvin Klein or whatever billboards, and you feel crappy about yourselves. Finally, men get it, that images matter. So images like this, or here, Men's Health magazine. Now these are two real athletes, but to look like this, I'm not saying these two, but if you see men who look like this, it's the result of where they work out all day long. They have trainers, they have special diets and diet coaches. Some men who look like this are taking steroids. And then to cap it all off, these images get photoshopped. You've probably seen it, but if you haven't, don't do it right now, but afterwards, Google Evolution of Beauty. Most of you have seen that? This 30-second video put up by Dove, the soap people. Anyway, if you haven't, Google it, Dove Beauty or Evolution of Beauty. It just takes I don't want to tell you what it is, no, I will tell you. It just takes a normal looking woman and through lighting, photography, photoshopping to turn her into a fashion billboard. And particularly if you have any kids in your life, it is a great one. Well, they do this now for men as well. And for my visit there, I got a hold of the original of this picture before he was photoshopped. Do you want to see what he looks like? This is absolutely incredible. This is him before he was photoshopped. It's an amazing image. We're going to keep that up for the rest of the talk. I really do love it. Anyway, let me go meta here for 1 second. So, I'm asking, what am I doing by talking about masculinity this way? Using this tone, using these images. Why am I doing it? Why am I doing this way? I don't mean for this group, but just imagine out there in the community or wherever. I'll say that's a question, not rhetorical.
You're poking fun at it.
Yeah. And I'm not just poking fun at it. Who am I poking fun at? Myself. So what that's doing is doing something that women can't do, talking to men. Because of course, if women start saying these things, a lot of men are going to get their back up. You're attacking men. You're male bashing. Feminists or man haters and so on. But one of the things that men can do in terms of education and outreach on gender issues is bring ourselves into the discussion. And we can do it in different ways. We can do it in terms of talking about some of our own experiences, what we learned right or wrong along the way. I can talk about the first time I basically was exposed to rape culture in grade 6 by a joke that I remember friends telling. So we're able to sort of tell our stories, but we're also able to make fun of it. Now the reason for making fun of it will become clear in 1 minute, I hope. The minute is actually here. It's coming right pretty quickly. Because when boys and men don't live up to these ideals and expectations, you will always be strong, you will always be powerful, you will be in control, you'll never back down, you will feel no fear, you'll make a ton of money, you'll have endless sex, the endless sex of course is only with women, on and on and on and on. What we do to boys and men, we humiliate them. And the standard practice in military and police training is reducing the sense of self, just like battering individual, particularly men's egos, and ego in the good sense, I don't mean puffed up sense necessarily, but reducing them to a childhood status so that you can insert a new level of parental authority, and the parental authority is your commanding officer. And so the use of humiliation to belittle men and boys to be a real man. And so the little boy who falls down, we say to him, big boys don't cry, suck it up, don't be a sissy, don't be a girl, don't be a baby, whatever. So we humiliate boys into manhood. We say that those boys, those men, those young boys and young men who don't make it, they're going to be ridiculed, they're going to be humiliated, they're going to be beat up, they're not going to have friends, they're not going to get the job that they want, whatever it might be. So there's a whole system of rewards and punishments to the boy that manages to navigate through these impossible demands and at least present himself as a real man. What this does is really tear men apart. One of the things that when you hear some of the men's rights speakers speak, they'll throw stats at you, and the stats are actually all correct, more or less. They'll say men die younger than women. That's absolutely true. Men die younger than women on average, for one reason, because men don't ask for help. We don't go to the doctor until it's too late. We don't get psychological support. We engage in risk-taking behavior more than women do. We smoke and we drink at higher rates. We're more likely to use violence in our lives, and certainly as teens probably experience physical violence. We're more likely, as stats tell us, when we're very young to experience severe corporal punishment. The girls are less likely to experience sexual violence, although as you know, also So the boy who manages to negotiate all of that, doesn't matter that we manage to sort of pose like, I'm a real man to the world, but inside there's that sense of, I'll never live up to these expectations. I'll never be that real man I'm supposed to be. And we'll see what the impact of that let me just mention one thing. In addition to that, to those, those health impacts and safety impacts and so forth, dying younger and so forth, we have impacts such as the use of violence to prove your credentials. And I'm going to return to that in a moment. I'm returning to a lot of things, but we're going to do it. So in other words, what I'm expressing here, and this would not be in a community talk, but the academic frameworks that I've used, and it's in the book, but what I call, going back to the 80s, I guess, men's contradictory experiences of power, or the paradox of men's power. And that is the very ways that we have defined a world of men's power within a patriarchal society has indeed brought forms of power and privilege to half of the species. And yet, those very ways we have constructed that world of men's power brings costs to men as well. Now, traditionally, those costs have been outweighed by the power. The benefits, the privileges have outweighed the costs. You've gotten ahead by living up to those expectations. One of the paradoxes of the steady empowerment and the ongoing empowerment of women is that for many men, the sense of tangible benefits have diminished. And that's been exacerbated for many men by growing economic inequality, by globalization, by the destruction of unions, the destruction of the middle class. And so there's a lot of men out there who actually are hurting, and hurting a lot economically, emotionally, because they grew up with the expectation if they did certain things and acted certain ways, they would be rewarded. We would be rewarded. So all the crap that you had to put up with and pretend to be and act, and how you could just tough it out or talk it out, to be on top, whatever it would be, depending on your class and so on, all that stuff, the benefits aren't as clear anymore for many, many men. And so part of what's happening is that the right wing has been able to mobilize that. The right wing has been able to mobilize that discontent and say, see, this is what happens when you have feminism, or this is what happens when you let others, so-called let other people in. And so you mobilizing various forms of hatred in order to mobilize those hurt men is part of the reality we're dealing with. One of the I can't remember what my next slide is. My goodness. Oh yeah, one thing I just wanted to point out. Notice I use the term men's contradictory experiences of power. We can't talk about men's experiences because our experiences are shaped as part of as we in the business call it, sort of an intersectional or intersecting parts of who we are, our identity, our experiences, various forms of power. So I cannot tell you what part of me is the man, is the white person, is the Jewish guy, is the hyper-educated guy, on and on and on. These become modifiers of each other. And different parts of my identity, who I am, how I experience the world. For some men, they confer more power, and for some men, they confer less power. And so these different experiences of power are shaped by our socioeconomic class, the color of our skin, our sexual orientation, where we're from originally, our physical differences, and so forth. Here's a picture. This is an intersectional picture. When I was a kid, I lived in North Carolina, as you can tell by my heavy Southern accent. And things were still racially segregated. African Americans were the beginning of the powerful years of the civil rights movement. But some of the demonstrations where you just see men, you see posters like this. Because certainly in the South where I lived, black men were not called men, they were called boys. And I often would hear that being referred to as boys. So this demasculinization. And so part of what was happening was an assertion of human rights, of self-pride and so forth, but it got articulated within a gendered context. And in fact, when you think of, going back to those Calvin Klein bodies that I showed you earlier, just, look at me and just, think Calvin Klein body. I mean, it doesn't look hard. But when you think of those things, Who started this image of what a man's body is supposed to be like? There's actually two groups of men in the U.S. It was gay men and it was African American men. That's where the sort of popularization of the really, the hyper-masculine body really started coming out in the 70s. And started coming out because in both cases, these are groups of men who had been belittled as men. And so it almost became part of this masculine protest. This is sort of intersectionality in action in the lives of men. Now, there's also a positive part of it. Part of what was happening in the gay community is men saying we've got to look after our bodies. We've got to, we can celebrate men's bodies and so forth. That's the cool part. But there's also this other part. When we think about this in relation to homophobia, it's pretty interesting. When I think about these hidden truths in men's lives, these barriers that none of us can live up to, we often think of them, think about that. We usually think of homophobia as fear or hatred of someone who is attracted to someone of the same sex, or relates sexually to them. But it's also, I forget if it's Greek or Latin, but maybe there's a skull here who knows this. Homo in one of those two means same, so same sex, and the other means man. And so I think there's actually deep fear in the lives of men, of other men. And the fear, I think, is about, will he discover my secret? And my secret is, I will never live up to those expectations. So men, again, have to fight to prove themselves as men. A final thing I just want to say, though, is that men's lives, and this is final before I actually get to the whole point of my talk, which I will run through. Are we doing a 1 or 1:30? Or 2? Or 6? Was it 1? 1. I'm going to have to talk fast. Leave when you have to. But anyway, men's lives are changing, and there's an ongoing demolition of the gender binary, including in the lives of men. This is a really interesting chart from the U.S. where things aren't as advanced and stuff as here. But when Pew Research asked women and men to just a few years ago to evaluate pale blue being a good parent, dark blue a successful marriage, and the white on the right, success in high-paying career, what you can see is the responses were basically exactly the same. In other words, both as women's lives change, but so have men's. So what do we do with this? I won't talk through these 2 slides because they have a ton of words on them, but I will send them to the center, and if anyone wants them, you can circulate them. But this gets into the question, how we can take the knowledge to engage men and boys. What do we know? What has the research showed us in terms of what is successful to actually reach men and boys, whether it's a community-based education program on ending men's violence, on issues around men's health, whatever it might be. But looking at gender transformative programs, doing, in a sense, in different ways, it doesn't have to be the same technique, but what I was saying that I've been doing in front of the group, being able to have an authentic discussion around men and masculinity. I choose to use humor to do that. Other people would do it in different ways. But all this is seeing men as part of the solution, and have to be part of our design of different, whether it's a campaign or group work, whatever it might be. There's a lot of different things that are key to engaging men and boys. Again, I'll circulate this, but it is about navigating through men's fear and both challenging inequality and abuse of power, but also understanding men's contradictory experiences about power if we actually want to reach them. This does not mean coddling men. This does not mean agreeing with or excusing abusive behavior, but we actually want to connect with men and not just feel good that I'm yelling at some guy for being a sexist jerk. If I want to connect with him and help him change, then I have to actually figure out how to reach him. I have to figure out what his experiences are, what he's coming from, what his fears are, what he knows, what he doesn't know. And a lot of that is about using positive messages are going to connect better, language of responsibility, avoiding collective blaming, shaming, guilting. It just doesn't work, even if it might make us feel good. Challenging them, being compassionate, creating safety. Again, the reason why I talk, when I do a lot of speaking, that's what I do for a living, but the reason I use humor, or as my wife would say, try to use humor, is because I want to create safety in a group. I want men to go, oh yeah, it's okay to talk about this. So anyway, I can circulate that. One of the things, I just want to try to apply this to a couple of different areas. There's chapters in the book, so after some of this general discussion, there's chapters on the book on ending men's violence, on the transformation of our workplaces and economy, and on the transformation of fatherhood. Around ending men's violence, of course, ultimately it's about ending patriarchy. That's the root of men's violence. Ending men's domination, social control, economic and political power is ultimately how we're going to end men's violence. We need research, we need campaigns, we need education, we need better laws. We need all those things. But we also need, specific efforts to directly address men, to bring men directly, name it as we're bringing men in. And one thing, as you heard at the beginning, that I've been part of is the White Ribbon Campaign, which three of us started back in 1991. It spread, I think, to 80 or 90 countries. I just keep hearing more of them. I just got, in the last month, emails from the White Ribbon Campaign in Ghana, the Ukraine, and Poland. Anyway, but it spread quickly across Canada because of the impact of the women's movement and the impact of the Montreal Massacre 2 years before we started. As you see, it spread around the world. And it spread around the world because one of the things we did that's both its strength and weakness is from the beginning we said this will be a decentralized campaign. No one owns it, no one controls it. So as it spread around the world, people just found their own way to reach boys and men. A carnival parade in Brazil, a rally outside of Parliament in Namibia to support a new law that was for the first time making rape and marriage a crime. A street thing happening in Beirut to get men to stop and talk. This is a good one. A wrestling tournament in Pakistan. Just finding ways how you're going to get men in the door or in the field. A poster in China where men are signing a pledge not to commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women. A demonstration in a place called here. This is my favorite white ribbon picture. It's a little boy saw people giving out white ribbons. He asked what it was. They started telling him what it was. He says, you don't have to tell me, I know all about violence against women. My dad beats up my mom. And of course, we all know in this room, or most of us, about the intergenerational transmission of men's violence. So the boy growing up with violence is more likely to use it in his own life than a boy who is not, although many boys also interrupt that cycle. Well, this boy is one of those, one of the latter. He said, can I help? And here he's just giving this white ribbon to a street vendor who's looking at this going, what the heck is this? And this little boy is explaining to him about the problem of men's violence against women and why he, as a man, should speak out. So I think as Canadians, we can be proud of this. It's something that was really, that developed and percolated across Canada, that really reflected the way we do things in Canada has had this impact around the world, including on a group of ex-bikers in New Zealand, South Africa, here in Canada. Even in Canada, it's a bit decentralized with different groups using sports. Increasingly, we're seeing in some countries white ribbon. You can see these very positive images. They're not images, there's no sort of black eyes, which we find in education just isn't effective. These are images of what men can do, rather than saying focus on what men shouldn't do. Making a difference, speaking out, using our strength. Increasing amount of stuff in the workplace. This is what came indirectly out of White Ribbon in Australia that developed a workplace accreditation program where companies had to develop research policies on sexual harassment, on issues around the impact of violence against women, on the workplace, and support women's groups in their communities. Hundreds and hundreds of companies, public sector, the armed forces in Australia has gone through the wider 2-year process to become part of this, including the mining giant Rio Tinto. And one of the projects that the center is involved in is work with a US and Brazilian-based NGO called Promundo that's doing education work with Rio Tinto. And I don't know, most of you, I don't know who here is, some of you who are here from the center, but others who are not, but you have the preeminent organization in the world doing work on the impact of violence against women, the impact on the workplace, and what workplaces can do to develop the policies, the training, the action, the community contacts, the support to support women who are, and men who are experiencing, or family members experiencing forms of violence and abuse outside of the workplace. And so here at Western, you can be really, really proud of the work being done. I do too, and others here, so thank you very much. The Moose High campaign, White Ribbons also inspired or worked with others who said, oh, we don't do white ribbons, but we'll do a chunk of moose as our symbol. I think I'm running out of time. I wanted, but I won't. That's life. But one of the big chapters is the importance of the transformation of fatherhood, of these idealized images of dad, or these images of dad as hopeless, and wait till your father comes home, to the importance of transforming fatherhood and household labor as a key thing for promoting gender equality, why it's what the dad tells us about the impact on children, and why it's important for men as a whole. And not just these pretty pictures of men helping out, but the true transformation of fathers. So men aren't helping out or babysitting, they're just doing the hard day in, day out work of being a dad. If you're interested in this subject, is an interesting one that brings together ending violence against women and the transformation of fatherhood. If you're interested in this, there's a website you might want to visit, a campaign that I'm part of called Men Care. Make sure you do men-care.org. That talks about, it's a global campaign, partly inspired by White Ribbon, but I think doing a much better job than we ever did in terms of coordination and impact. Can I take just 2 or 3 minutes to, is that okay? Do leave if you have to, of course we will. But gender equality and beyond. So my book, the framework is promoting gender equality or gender equity. We need equality, but we also need fairness. Having a breastfeeding space in the workplace is not an equality measure. It's an equity measure. It's fairness. There's no breastfeeding room for males, so you don't need the equal breastfeeding room for males and females. But you need equity. You need fairness. And of course, it's all about overall winning equality. So we need that, but it's not enough. When you think about it, there's been so much, and the whole sort of lean-in feminism is based on the assumption that women just need to push their way in to the power structures, the forms of being, the self-identity, really, that men have worked hard to develop and have learned to be, how we've learned to act in a corporate environment or political environment, how we learn to be men. What I've been talking about, and this is why the paradox of men's power is so critical, is we see the downside of that for men themselves, for ourselves. And it's not bad for men, but the consequences of that are things such as men's violence against women. And the work I've done over the years on men's violence against women, it looked at the existence of the violence both as a use of violence as a tool to have power and control, drawing, of course, on a feminist analysis as a result of the men's sense of entitlement, all those things that have been the bedrock of the feminist analysis, but also the result of this contradictory experience of power. Individual men using violence as a tool to prove they have power because they feel they don't, and using violence to not just enforce a relationship with power, but to, as a consequence of feeling they don't live up to these expectations of manhood. And that's one of the reasons why you have you have men who commit an act of domestic violence and immediately start apologizing. Partly they're doing it so she won't call the cops, of course. Partly they're doing it because he wants to maintain control and is screwing around with her mind and playing with her. But partly at that point, he actually doesn't need to use violence because he feels like a man again. He's been dominant. And so in terms of this bizarre equation, he's a man again who at that moment doesn't need to use violence. And I think some of these men actually believe at that point he won't use violence again. So we have these bizarre behaviors that are a result of bizarre realities. So we don't just want women to be able to be like men. Our ideal of having equal participation of women in the political world is not to have a whole bunch of Margaret Thatchers. That's not, I don't think, what most of us would want to be fighting for. An individual who can, outdo any of the men around her. She did, whether it's waging war or cutting social services. That shouldn't be our ideal. So it's not just about equality. I think we need to go back, and this was my last word in the book, more or less. I think we need to go back to some of the original ideas and ideals of the women's movement in the late 60s, early 70s. The phrase gender equality was not heard. It was invented, it was first used by a sociologist in the early 70s. Most of us, I certainly didn't hear it for many, many years after that. Some of you may remember the term that was used back then. Remember? Even if you heard feminism, of course, but you heard mainly women's liberation. And I think we should rekindle that idea of liberation. Not just women's liberation, but human liberation. Because if indeed we're talking about transformation of